Welcome to another episode of Top Lines and Tails, your weekly livestock podcast. And as always, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Harborough, for their continued support. This week on the podcast, we're talking to a man who needs little introduction. They're from up there in Turriff in Aberdeenshire, top breeder of sheep and cattle and all sorts, and a mine of information. And it's a pleasure to talk to Bruce Mair. Welcome to the podcast, Bruce. And Bruce, just tell me a little bit about the Mair's family there at Muiresk. When did you first move up to Turriff?
We moved to Turriff in early 40s, 1941.
Okay. I believe Kinnermit there is a dairy farm primarily, isn't it, or was?
Yes, it was a dairy farm until just quite recently.
Uh-huh.
It was the main enterprise at the farm.
And for those listeners that don't know the Turriff area, some fantastic land up there in Aberdeenshire will grow anything, but it'll grow grass, that's for sure, won't it?
Yes, it's a fertile area, a lot of mixed farms.
Mm-hmm. And the dairy cattle there would be Friesians originally, would it?
It was originally Friesians, and we changed over to Holsteins in the early 60s.
Uh-huh.
From there on, sort of built up a Holstein herd.
That's right, and a very successful Holstein herd it was as well. Used to get out and show those Holsteins and win a lot of prizes, I remember.
Yes, I attended most of the local shows and also the Royal Highland.
Mm-hmm.
Had a stiff competition in those days. There was a lot of dairy herds, Aberdeenshire as well as wider range of Scotland, but it was reasonable success at the shows over the years.
You're a modest man. I know you had lots of success there, and a lot of people, of course, will know the name of Muiresk there from Suffolk's, and I think it was the 50s maybe when you first got into Suffolk sheep, would it be, Bruce?
We went into Suffolk's and along with my brother Kenny. We started in the mid-50s, I think, around 1955. Bought a group of sheep from a big flock in England, Ashbalking flock, and started with a few ewes from there and gradually expanded.
The sheep would be a lot different back then, Bruce, wouldn't they? They'd be a different type back then.
Oh, yes. There's been a big change in type over the years. The early years were lighter in the bone, the Suffolks, and gradually they developed more bone. Maybe to some extent it went too far in that direction.
But it's known that Aberdeenshire area there will grow bone, that Turriff area there will grow bone better than maybe in a lot of places. Yes,
there was a group of well-known flocks in Aberdeenshire in those days, and very stiff competition.
And of course, there was a whole band of you, as you said, in that Aberdeenshire area had pretty much control on the Suffolks going back. Certainly going into the 80s, Jimmy Wilson we've had on this programme, and Jimmy Douglas, and a few of you there had a good hand on the Suffolks.
There was 5 or 6 leading flocks, very stiff competition. Annually went down annually to the Royal Showground, to the National Show, and then the following week to Edinburgh, the show and sale there.
Yes, yeah.
12-hour journey down to Stoneleigh, but it was usually worthwhile.
It certainly was.
Even in those days, way back, the float load of sheep often grossed over 100,000, so it was a worthwhile journey.
It certainly is. And I'm going to mention another Wilson. I mentioned Jimmy Wilson, but Robbie Wilson, I think, came to work for you as a shepherd in the early 80s, I would say.
Yes, he was began his career at Kinnermit as a shepherd, and from there on, he eventually acquired the tenancy of a neighbouring farm, and he's one of the best-known breeders of Suffolks and in the present time also of Texels.
That's right.
He's sold his Suffolks a few years ago, dispersed them to concentrate on Texels.
Yeah, and of course he's well known to many of us. Of course,
an eye for a good animal and allied to an appetite for hard work, and he's also been a teacher to a lot of aspiring breeders over the years. A lot of young Irishmen did their apprenticeship work with Robbie, the present Lakeview flock. It was one example. There's others I could mention as well. Thriving in Ireland at the present day, and no doubt learned a lot of the tricks from Robbie.
Yeah, that will be right. And you're right, Ireland is a hotbed of good Suffolks these days. Most of the good Suffolk flocks are over that side, and a credit to yourself as well. There'll be some of Muiresk breeding will have gone over there as well, of course, and to get these boys set up.
Yes, aye.
But we go into the Suffolks. I think you, by the time I kind of remember into the early 90s anyway, you'd broken records regularly. I think 20,000 in 1992 and a top average there, I think, of about 8,000. That's starting to come to a lot of money there by then, Bruce.
Yes, I equated to modern times. It was big money. And the early 90s, I sometimes historically refer to these years as the glory years. Several big. 1995 was possibly the pinnacle. Where a sheep Suffolk made 65,000 and a Texel 33,000. So
that's right.
That's 1995. That's almost 30 years ago. So
getting that way, but I mean that sheep was of course Muiresk King of Diamonds, and he wasn't just a top price sheep, but a hell of a breeder, wasn't he?
That's correct. It was bought by Cairness. The Texel was bought by a well-known Texel breeder at Glenside, John Forsyth.
Yeah.
Did well in his flock.
So we'll go on to the Texels in a minute, but just sticking with the Suffolks there, you would have, as I said, been in control, and you'd go down and show at the Highland Show, and you'd have won the Highland Show any amount of times, Bruce, with Suffolks.
Yes, I did. For several years, the Muiresk flock won several championships at the Royal Highland, and different sheep. Weren't all high-priced sheep. Possibly in the Suffolk world, in the early years, the animal that did most for the flock and did quite a lot for the breed was a sheep called Southmoss Sterling.
Okay.
It was bought for £130 at Kelso, and grew into a magnificent animal, just a late maturing animal, and a neighbouring breeder was paying 200 quid a straw. That's way back, and it was well thought of. It was a daughter of that sheep bred then record price sheep Muiresk President, which made 8,000.
Okay.
At the time, that was the then breed record. Lucky purchase. The breeder was John Moore of football fame.
Oh, of the football pools, yes, of course, the John Moores. I know that he as an able man was John, wasn't he? Was in Angus cattle as well, of course, and known.
Guys, a lot of success in that sphere.
And his brother, of course, would have been his brother or his cousin would have been at Bapton with Shorthorns as well. So a well-known family.
Yes, they did well in the Shorthorn world. That the Bapton herd, the same family.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm going to mention a Suffolk ewe that you had called K79. It'll be a while back now, I believe, Bruce, but she'd be a sheep that left you some good families.
Yes, it bred that particular ewe. It's buried at Canermit, and I think there's a big cherry tree in its grave. And at the time, it bred a succession of high-priced animals. I think the overall total was well into the six-figure range. Again, that's going back quite a number of years. I think the progeny grossed well over 150,000 from that one ewe.
One ewe, yeah.
Just there was different click with most sires that was used on it.
And there wouldn't be a lot of embryo transfer, not back in those early days. That wouldn't be like the boys now fleshing 100 embryos out of her. This most would be naturally bred. Didn't she live till she was about 10 years old, if I remember right? Yes,
that's correct. No, there was no ET work in those days. It was just natural natural breeding.
Yeah.
Did eventually graduate ET work through the pioneer in that sphere, John Robertson of the Rowett.
Of course.
He introduced us. And he was one of the early pioneers in that field.
John Robertson has been on this podcast, and a very clever man that he was. And I know he worked with you very closely with your early Suffolks on the nutritional side of it as well. And of course, it very much involved in Harborough, who was sponsored this podcast.
That's correct. I did a lot of pioneer work, and a very modest man, but as you've already stated, was a genius in his own field and very persistent. And the early days where there was a ram Bridgestone Titanic that sadly didn't work naturally, hence the name, but John worked on it through AI work, and eventually he did a lot of pioneer work with the ram, and he was proved to be a success in that field. Otherwise, it would have been a total write-off.
And you did a bit of work, of course, with who used to be my neighbour, John Sinnott, down in the south there. John came into the swim, getting in amongst you Aberdeen boys, trying to shake it up there. But John did fairly well. I think you bought a few tups back off him over the years.
Oh, yes. I was a lot of cross-dealing with John. As you've already stated, he was one of the premier breeders in England, and reciprocal work with a lot of success with some of his sheep, and hopefully he'd similar success with some of ours.
I think
he bought one of the best sheep, in my opinion, that was ever bred in the Suffolk world. In his day, was a sheep that was suitably named Muiresk Martin. That John bought in partnership with the Perrinpit flock, and did a lot of good work down there. It's a record price, 20,000 at the Kelso sales in those days.
Yeah, tremendous that he did. And as I said, you bought a few sheep back with him. Bruce, I just want to talk to you a little bit about line breeding. I remember you doing a talk to the Suffolk breeders, I think in the northeast, about how you line bred these sheep, and it's something that fascinates me. I seem to remember that you kept the Suffolks in sort of 3 families. Can you tell me a little bit more how that sort of worked for you?
Occasionally we tried experimentally. Put a mated Suffolk ram with one of his best daughters, and to be perfectly honest, there was a sheep, Bridgestone Blenheim, and he bred a son. I called him Muiresk Double Blenheim. He was a splitting image of the father, at quite a reasonable price, 2,000 or 3,000 at the time. One of the pitfalls of that type of breeding, wouldn't divulge at the time, was that this double Blenheim had a twin brother that was hopelessly deformed at birth. So that's the danger if you line breed. There's always a danger that some of the negative factors come out. And I wouldn't. Most of the societies now try to religiously avoid line breeding.
Well, there's line breeding. It maybe depends how close you breed them, because a couple of generations down, yes, I think bringing it back.
Correct. In most breeds, especially some of the minority breeds, there's too much line breeding, in my opinion, and the breed societies now try to avoid that. Complex equations, which I don't personally understand, but especially the Texel Society, I reckon they're going in the right direction to avoid it. Same with the Holsteins as well.
Yeah, and you did disperse the Suffolk flock. Was it 2004 or 5 when you dispersed the Suffolks away?
Yes, well, we actually divided the enterprise a few years prior to that, around 2000. I took part of the business, Texel sheep at that time, and my brother Kenny carried on with Suffolk for several more years. Again, with quite a lot of success, the early 2000s. And they dispersed the flock, I think it was around 2005.
And
quite a lot of money at the time.
And there would be a flock there which confused me a little bit, a Deverendale flock. So did they start them under another prefix? Is that still still Mair's breeding with the Deverendale flock with the Suffolks?
Devon with the Suffolks, I think, Devon side. Devon side was the Holstein prefix.
Okay.
And that was the prefix they used with the Holsteins.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And Deverendale was another neighbouring flock.
Okay. That's cleared that up. And of course, the Devon being the river that runs through Turriff there.
Yes, correct. Caernarfon, the home farm is just in the banks of the River Devon.
That's right. And as you mentioned, the Texels there, you went into the Texels when obviously you could see that the Texels were starting to come, and you guys went into the Texels and made a big splash fairly early on with your Texels.
We went into with commercial sheep at the time, and we saw that the Texels were on the crest of the wave. I think the year was 1989. Decided to go in for Texels at that point. The leading breeder of the time was Keith, still for a lesser extent now, is Keith Jimison.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He had a waiting list for buyers. So we bought sheep from various flocks down in Lanarkshire. Mm-hmm. Just a selection of ewe lambs, and one or two of them non-starters, of course. But I think there was 2 families of mares from that initial group of purchases, some of whom were from the Clarks. They were at the fore at the time, and Warnock, Jim, they're both well-known breeders over the years.
Of course.
That was some of the original female stock.
Mm-hmm. And both Jimmy Warnock and the Clarks have been on this podcast in the past, and top breeders, as you say. And there would be a ram that did you a lot of good earlier on, be a ram called Baltier Winston. I think he came to your...
that's correct. We bought that ram from Robert Forsyth, Baltier, and actually in partnership with other flocks, Willie Knox, Mid-Haddo, a neighbouring flock. He did a powder good at the time. And he was actually unknown to us, and a stroke of luck. He was ARR. That stood us in good stead as well. Mm-hmm. It was basically some of his daughters that bred some of the leading rams at the mares from the flock in those early years. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think the ram cost around 9,000, but by modern standards was a bargain at the time.
Yes. And you mentioned you had a sheep at 33,000. Of course, that was Muiresk Blondin, a record breaker. And again, he went to a good home, didn't he?
Yes, Blondin was bred from one of the best daughters of Baltier Winston. Mm-hmm. He was by Keith Jimison, kindly loaned us a sheep on in 101. Okay. With a sheep from Keith that wasn't 100% fertile, and being a generous man, he loaned us 101. It was one of his best rams at the time, and he was the father of Muiresk Blondin.
Mm-hmm. I remember 101. Remember 101. He was a very good breeder for you and quite a few people. I think there was a lot of seamen.
Yes,
seamen used of him.
He did well. He did well within the Arnon flock as well at the time. Mm-hmm. He was responsible for quite a few better sheep at the mares in the flock in the years that followed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then I'm going to move on a little bit to a ram called Craighead Hercules, and of course that was in the foot and mouth year, and you guys all clubbed together, paid another record price for him.
That's correct. There was, I think, the sale was at the hotel in Lanark. It was during the foot and mouth campaign, and formed a syndicate at the time, and it cost 50,000. Again, he emerged as one of the important sheep of his generation. Went round several flocks at the time, and he was certainly an asset to the breed in general. Mm-hmm. developed and mature. Tremendous ram.
I think one of the most successful Texels of all time, probably. And did you see him as a lamb? Did you go down there to Alan Cullen's and see him as a lamb, and that's why you bought him, or did you just buy him on the videos?
No, we went down to the farm personally and saw the sheep, and he was head and shoulders above the other animals of his generation. At the time, tremendous all-round sheep.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, I'm studying the history of the Texels at the moment for a book that's coming out, and as I said, Craig and Hercules comes up there as probably one of the most successful breeders of all time. Bred, I don't know how many thousands of pounds worth off him, but certainly a lot anyway. You got your money back?
I would certainly endorse that opinion, yes.
Uh-huh. And then another top ram, again, I remember you guys buying, I think was Top Hill Joe, and he was 120,000, another record price, but I think you were pushed by a syndicate of boys. By that time, there might be 5 or 6 of you bought that ram, was there? Quite a few anyway.
Yes, I was a very stylish ram, but again, looking back, possibly the modern standards, when he matured into a mature ram, he didn't have the scale that the modern Texel has. Mm-hmm. And he was a mature ram. He was limited in size, and you didn't compare, in my opinion, with Craighead Hercules. And so at the time, he sired a lot of stylish sheep. We had 1 or 2 decent ones, but to be honest, that was the era of ARR. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And bad luck, 1 or 2 good rams that year, but they were ARR, ARH, ARQ. And instead of being 10,000, a ceiling of 1,000 of a ram was in that category.
You're right. And
it started the market. It started the Texel market, in my opinion. There was a lot of good genetics lost at the time by the rams with the unpopular genotype that naturally had to be used in a limited scale or discarded altogether.
And you're right, for our listeners that don't understand those numbers, that of course was the scrapie gene when they were trying to eliminate the disease of scrapie, and as you said, a lot of the animals fell into category 2 and got lost. Yeah.
Yes, I did. It's certainly a progressive move, and it's come into fashion again more recent years, especially within the Suffolk breed. Mm-hmm. If a Suffolk ram is not the ARR at the present day, it's only of commercial value.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And
no matter how good all-round conformation it has.
And I'm going to mention another Bruce, and that'd be Bruce Rennick. And Bruce Rennick came up. I think he worked did he do a year maybe with Keith Jameson? Then he came up to work with you as well, and then married into the family, Bruce. Yes,
he came up, and originally met him. I was down buying Holstein heifers in Crewe Market, and he was there with his father that day, and he was looking for a job up north where he might broaden his experience, and that sort of set the seed going, and he came up and worked at Carnarvon for quite a period of time at the time. Mm-hmm. And tremendous enthusiasm for pedigree sheep, and as you just stated, his subsequent years he's had a lot of success within the breed. And he's also a son at present. Is very keen and continue the tradition.
Okay, and of course the Castle Cairn flock, as you said, became one of the top flocks in the country, hitting some big prices, 40s and £50,000. And I believe that you would have worked together with some flushing by that time. You're doing a bit of embryo work with those, and I remember reading a paper that you'd written for the Texel Journal about how the flushing, some of these flushing ewes had all of a sudden started to make some serious, reap some serious rewards.
Yes, there's one in particular, a ewe, a star ewe that I think we bought in partnership by my son Colin and Bruce Rennick, and flushed the ewe, and I think he had more success than we had. We generated quite a lot of money at the time, joint flushing program. And again, it's sort of early days, but that technology, of course, has gathered pace over the years, and virtually all the leading Texel rams of today are born through ET work.
Mm-hmm. And that you particularly, did she not come from Dugan Hill, if I'm right? Was he GCK 9996 I've got written down here? Would that be the one you're talking about, Bruce?
I think that's the one that you're referring to, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she certainly went on and left hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of progeny, if I remember right, certainly for Castle Cairn. So the Texels went well for you, but then you dispersed the Texels after a while. By that time, I think, Bruce, you'd gone into Beltex, but you dispersed the Texel flock. What was the reason for that? Can you tell me?
Well, my son Colin, he was involved in dairy farming, and at the time, Texels at that farm, his main farm, mineral deficient, and quite honestly, even with the best management at the time, slightly deficient as a band of land, deficient in copper and cobalt in particular. Modern world, it's been rectified through minerals. We couldn't actually compete in a level playing field, for instance, with our neighbour Willie Knox, share rams, and Willie's came to sales. Willie's rams with similar management were twice the size, and Colin got slightly disillusioned and profit margins declining, so he decided just disperse the entire flock, and quite a successful dispersal at the time. I think it grossed around 200,000 at the dispersal.
Mm-hmm. And when was that?
I was quite cheap myself, and by that time I'd dabbled in, along with a friend, the late Jock Allen, dabbled with Beltex, so we kept a nucleus of Beltex and expanded from there on. They do quite well in the same land, and with proper mineral nutrition, they thrive quite well.
I remember you coming to our farm to see, you and Keith Jameson came to the farm shortly after Foot and Mouth, and to look at the Beltex there. I think you might have bought a couple off my father, if I remember right.
Yes, I was down at some of the initial purchases on your own neck of the woods. I remember a trip I had out to your father's farm from down selling sheep at Worcester. I think from memory I bought a couple of ewe lambs, and some of the initial stock bought at the time to build up the Beltex. But with Beltex, there's a lot of disasters behind the scenes. These two ewe lambs developed into two good animals, to be dead honest. For both disasters in the end, one went on its back during the night. By morning, the foxes had ripped out its udder. The second one was a very good ewe, actually. An apprentice vet was doing a cesarean, trainee vet, and sadly he hit an artery. The ewe was dead within 10 minutes. I think we managed to get out two lambs alive, but it just shows the pitfalls, disappointments that hit all breeders. Naturally, most of them are kept below the carpet, but that was two examples. It's still clear in my mind.
There'll be plenty more. Can you tell me what rams that you use that influence your flock there? It's the Avimore Beltex flock that you have, and what rams did you use that sort of influenced them, because you went on and did well with the Beltex?
Well, the ram at the most positive influence was a ram. It was first prize as a ram lamb at the Highland Corsten Whistler. Developed into a massive mature ram. We share this, as most breeders in the Beltex world do, with two breeders in Orkney. But again, tragedy struck quite early in his career. During the breeding season up in Orkney, the fight with another ram, and his brain damaged. Brought his career to premature end, but that ram left a lot of good stock throughout the flock and also the Arcadian flocks as well.
Uh-huh. Yep.
But again, that's just showing the pitfalls.
You're being very honest with us. Not everybody comes up with that honesty, but you're right. Sometimes they can come.
There's other rams that have a positive influence. Bought rams from famous breeders Neil and Janet McQuiston, Ariel, and a ram, Jimmy, and another one, Avicii. He only died last year at 8 years old. They both had a positive influence in the flock, as they did also up in Orkney. And more recently, the ram, it's been a staple. But apart from our flock, the famous Woody's flock, and others as well, is used throughout the breed is Bailey Brook CR7.
Okay.
Again, he goes back to Ariel and bloodlines on the female side. Last year we had to use the ram heavily with disappointments with other rams.
You bought a ram. You bought a ram last year for 30,000. Was he okay, Fockhill Godfather?
Yes, again that illustrates some of the disappointments. The ram still is healthy and fresh as ever. But with a total disaster, breeding-wise, he wouldn't cooperate during the AI. Tried several occasions, and fellow breeder Jim Young, who's a genius with handling sheep, he luckily managed to get the ram to cooperate and left stock at Jim's farm. But I think we managed to get one ewe and lamb to him. That was it. Hopefully he's still alive, so we might have a final throw of the dice this year. And he's a very attractive ram, and he's fit and looks as healthy as ever. But just again shows the fact that it, especially with AI work, ET work, it's hit or miss. Sometimes you get a harvest of embryos, and other times very poor results. And again, this is a similar facet throughout the breed.
Yeah, right. And you share him, I think, with Ross and Kirsty Williams, who have moved up. They'll be neighbours of yours somewhere by there.
Yes, they've also shared this Foghill ram, and I haven't spoken to Ross or Kirsty recently. I think they had limited success as well as far as the breeding during the breeding season. So he'll get a final throw of the dice this year during the breeding season. No doubt Jim Young might come up with a decent lamb at the forthcoming sales down at Carlisle. Haven't seen Jim's lambs, but he's as ever, he's very optimistic about them.
Okay, and I was talking to you yesterday, and I believe you're selling the entire crop of Gimmers at Carlisle there, and we should tell people that the Beltex sale at Carlisle is the middle of August there. And he said you got 40 or so going down there, Bruce?
I would be there personally, but my son Colin basically is growing quite a lot of cereals now. Malting barley in particular, just the time element, the profitability factor. This is common throughout the pedigree sheep world, is in the decline with ever less escalating costs. So he's decided at this moment in time to reduce numbers, and instead of going around 5 or 6 sales, the entire crop of gunners, as you've just noted, they're going to Carlisle on the 4th of August. Hopefully it'll be a sale. It'll attract a few buyers. The Lipley flock, there are 2 young breeders, very prominent. One the Great Yorkshire and one the Royal Highland. Of a selection of very good gunners, as has Grant Anderson, who's auctioneer, who's the top flight flock. And the Ingrams, who are famous in Aberdeenshire, of a selection of gunners. So it's an evening sale at Carlisle, and hopefully they might attract a few buyers. Also, we recognise the the demand for Beltex females over the last few years, the graph is in decline. Yeah. One of the reasons is a lot of the hobby breeders in recent years have orientated towards Dutch spotted, blue Texels, various other imported breeds. It's their choice. But the Beltex females in particular, saturation point. So hope there's a reasonable sale at Carlisle, but again, going back to the more prolific years, trade was better. We'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm. How many's in that sale, Bruce, just so our listeners can dial in and maybe have a bid online?
It's an evening sale. There'll be online bidding available. Again, the gimmers from these other established flocks, through word of mouth, I've heard there's quite a good selection. Mm-hmm. Our lot includes daughters of Bailey Brook CR7, Areola da Vici. There's quite a lot of well-known sires. A young sire, Morton's Geronimo's, bred very well with us. So we've all told, there's quite a few attractive gimmers within the offering. So
how many?
Just have to wait and see. And
how many in the sale? How many in the sale, Bruce, altogether?
There'll be about, I think there'll be about between 80 and 90 gimmers. We've 48, and the other flocks have slightly smaller amounts, but I haven't seen the final draft of the catalogue, but there'll be over 80 sheep at the sale. It starts at the early evening, 5:30 to be precise, at Carlisle.
Okay.
Friday the 4th of August.
Well,
there's a plethora of sales this year, but it's one of the sales that hopefully will attract a few potential buyers. And for anybody entering the breed or expanding, the sheep will be at realistic prices, as opposed to what they were 5-10 years ago when the breed was expanding.
Okay. And we'll move on to one more breed. I mentioned the Shorthorns earlier on, and now it's Kenny's grandson, I think, has now gone into Shorthorns and doing quite well.
That's correct. My brother Kenny's grandson, he's also Kenny Mair. His sister, Sally Mair. They're very enthusiastic young breeders, and they're building up a Shorthorn herd, have done over the last 4 or 5 years. And, some success at the Highland Show, and last week at the local New Deer Show, their best cow was reserved champion. They've also a larger herd of stabilizers.
Okay.
That's amongst their cattle enterprise.
Okay.
But hopefully they've had some reasonable success selling some animals privately for fairly high prices, and with the degree of enthusiasm they have and effort to put in, I'm sure they'll gain momentum the years to come.
That's great to see the Muiresk's name coming forward again. And you're right, I was at the Shorthorn sale, and some tremendous cattle, and I know a few Shorthorn breeders are all keeping their eye on young Kenny there. He seems to be certainly coming forward, continuing that good eye that you Mairs all seem to have, that exceptional eye for livestock.
Yes, I haven't seen the herd recently, but any time I've asked Kenny Junior, he's very confident and enthusiastic, and so I would predict that we'll have quite a bit of success in the years to come.
And a nice fella that he is too. Well, Bruce, I wish you success with the sale of your Beltex skimmers, and it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you after all these years. I've not seen you in a while, but you're a man I've always looked up to, and I think a lot of our listeners would say the same.
Well, congratulations yourself. You've certainly developed other avenues in your career since I met you 20-25 years ago. So I didn't realise you had such latent talent at the time. Every success, you bring a lot of enjoyment through your podcasts. which I glad occasionally see and hear on Facebook.
Well, that's very kind of you to say so. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and we wish you all success in the future.
Thank you very much, then.
Well, thanks, Bruce. That's been super. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Top Lines and Tales, and we'd like to thank our sponsors, Harbro, for their continued support, and don't forget that our guest this week, Bruce Mair, would have been one of the men who would be a pioneer behind the great range of feeds that Harbro developed, where they really started in the sheep world until they expanded into the cattle, but of course the commercial world as well. So don't forget that Harbro have a deep history in creating winners and feeding winners, and look up Harbro on the internet, or contact your local representative where you can find more information about their range of products. And while you're on the internet, don't forget to look up the Top Lines and Tales Facebook page, and please join in our community there, where you'll find photographs and other information to back up this and previous episodes. And of course, please, if you're listening to this podcast, just click on the follow button on the podcast, and then you'll get notified whenever a new podcast is made available. So thanks for your listening.